I am Mark Allenbaugh, a resident of Northeast Ohio. I live right on Lake Erie and have an obsession with the Marquette Bessemer. This presentation is a little history behind the Marquette Bessemer #2 that you see here in front of you, as well as the enduring mystery of why it hasn't been found. And most importantly, and ultimately what this presentation will be about, is where I think she rests. So, just a quick review. Again, this is a picture of the Marquette Bessemer. It was a car ferry that sank in Lake Erie back on December 7th or 8th, 1909. It was about 350 feet long overall, approximately 60 feet from the bottom of its keel up to the top, up to the top of the bridge. This picture here shows actually an explosion. Uh, Lake Erie, for those of you that don't know, does freeze over from time to time, or freezes over in part. And sometimes ships get stuck, or used to, and they would have to put dynamite, explode dynamite next to the ships to dislodge them from the ice. And this happens to be a rather interesting and rare picture of the Marquette Bessemer being dislodged from ice. The Marquette Bessemer was a coal car ferry, or a rail car ferry. You can see here in the back, and this actually looks to be a picture of the port of Ashtabula, or could it be Conneaut? But nonetheless, you can see here a bunch of rail cars with coal in them. You can see the coal mounds here in the back. What the Marquette Bessemer was designed to do is these rail cars would enter in through the stern here. She could hold up to 34, I believe, or 32 of these rail cars, and she would transport them across Lake Erie from Conneaut, Ohio, which is on the southern shore of Lake Erie, to Port Stanley, Ontario, Canada, which is on the northern shore. It's approximately a 55-mile journey, which would take her about 5 hours. From my research, I understand that she would do this trip daily. Here's a better picture of her less obscured, and what this shows is her open stern here, where again the rail cars, and it looks like you can see some rail cars in there, and you can see a person standing there on her stern, give you a little perspective of how large this ship was. By no means a Titanic, but a very large ship nonetheless. She was made of steel. She was also considered state-of-the-art at the time she was built, very advanced for her time in 1909. She was built in 1905, lasted 4 years until she sank. Even though she was considered state-of-the-art, one of the interesting things that she did not have at that time, she certainly had lifeboats. We'll talk about that here in a second, but she didn't have any wireless communication. So when she was in trouble out in the lake, she wasn't able to call for help or identify where she was at the time of her sinking, which is part of the reason why she still hasn't yet been found. The reason why she sank, though, is right here, and I don't think that's much of a mystery, and most people don't believe that it is much of a mystery. This open stern here, just a month before she sank, her captain, Robert McLeod, had complained to the owners of the Marquette Bessemer about this open stern. Back in November of 1909, the ship almost sank when a stern wave hit her, going this direction in a following sea. So it's just about swamped her. All that water going in, through the entire deck. So he had demanded that the owners put a stern gate on. They agreed to do so. This was going to be the last trip of the season for the Marquette Bessemer, at which point they were going to lay her up, put any other repairs and modifications that need to be made, as well as add that stern gate. Unfortunately, that was not to be. There were approximately 32 to 36 individuals on the ship. There were no survivors and only 14 bodies recovered. This picture shows the bodies of 9 individuals. These men were found in a lifeboat think it was lifeboat number 2, about 3 or 4 days after the sinking of the ship. They were found about 15 miles out in Lake Erie in a lifeboat. Unfortunately, all of them were frozen to death. There was the clothing of a 10th person that was found neatly folded behind one of these individuals in the lifeboat. Obviously, we don't know what happened to that person. Some speculate that he had gone mad from the cold and jumped into the lake. Sometimes that is known to happen when individuals are freezing or they're suffering from the severe effects of hypothermia. Brain starts sending funny signals, and they believe that they're actually overheating. This happens with mountain climbers from time to time. And they'll strip off all of their gear and then end up just the inevitable comes much quicker. Or what others speculate, and perhaps more likely, is that this individual dove into the lake to try to swim to shore or to get help or something along those lines. Of course, he didn't make it. What had happened by the way, on that day when it had left port, it left December 7th, 1909 at about 10:43 a.m. For its typical journey across. It was 40 degrees out, clear skies. When it had gotten about halfway across the lake, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, what Lake Erie is known for, especially this time of the year, big storm rolled in, and the temperature dropped from 40 to 10 degrees. And because Lake Erie also, as we'll discuss, is so shallow, waves came up quite quickly, and that ultimately caused the demise of the ship, as well as many others. Lake Erie happens to be the most dangerous of the Great Lakes, or at least used to be the most dangerous of the Great Lakes for commercial shipping. So, and here are the 10 individuals, or the 9 individuals that were found. 5 other individuals eventually were recovered in the subsequent months, and I think years after the sinking of the Marquette Bessemer, including the captain, Captain Robert McLeod, was found off the shores of Erie, Pennsylvania, several months after the sinking. Unfortunately, he had most likely gone down with the ship, and then his body floated up and was frozen, most likely in the lake. And once the lake thawed out, then his body drifted ashore, and they found it there. Interesting story, though, about when they found his body. And by the way, he was Canadian national, but he's buried in Conneaut, Ohio. I happen to live not too far from his gravesite. I had an opportunity recently to go see it. It's very poignant gravesite, very interesting. The marker is slightly askew from the rest of the gravestones there. Apparently somebody had tried to move it a few years, and I'll see what we can do to get it moved back into its proper location. At any rate, when his body was found, there were several slash wounds, or for lack of a better term, just slash wounds or injuries to the body. One of these gentlemen here was the steward. I'm not sure which one was the steward. I think it may have been this gentleman right here. That looks like a Smith on him. At any rate, the steward was found with 2 knives and a cleaver on him. And by the way, all of these individuals, none of them had winter gear on. The speculation was they just had regular clothes on, that they had abandoned ship very quickly, so they didn't have time to get their winter gear on. At any rate, the steward had these knives on him, and it was very odd. Why would a steward go run and get these knives? Some have speculated that given that the steward had these knives on him, and that the captain eventually was found with slash wounds on him, or what appeared to be wounds, that maybe there was some foul play that had occurred during the panic and the rush to abandon ship and get in the lifeboats. That is obviously that is complete speculation, and furthermore, because the captain's body had been adrift for so long, there could have been many different things that could have caused the wounds on the body, especially, again, given the long period of time. And it could have been cut along the ship itself when the body floated to the surface or what have you. At any rate, an interesting side story, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by the Marquette and Bessemer's story is not just with the stinking and not just with its enduring mystery, but the eeriness about how it sunk, and it's considered to this day to be not only the holy grail of the of shipwrecks here in Lake Erie, but also a ghost ship, probably the most famous ghost ship on the lake. Some claim to still, excuse me, hear its distress call from time to time when there's a large storm or something on the lake. At any rate, this was from a news article not too long ago. You could find this online. It discusses in a little bit more detail um, the theory about how it flooded again, stern wave coming into the hull or into the main holding center of the ship and eventually caused it sinking. Here's a little overview of Lake Erie. You can see this is Conneaut, Ohio. This is over here at Port Stanley, again about 55 miles. We're going to get into this a little bit in more depth, in more detailed charts. What some say, and you can see here, there are some reported sightings and hearings of it over here, as well as over here, plus some sightings just to the east, slightly northeast of Conneaut, in between Conneaut, Ohio, and Erie, Pennsylvania. By the way, right about here is the Pennsylvania state line. So it's not clear. There's contradictory information, but most likely what happened is she went all the way over here and then tried to come back, and that's when she sank. So just real quickly, a couple of books that I have uh, based my evaluation on, and for those of you who are interested, and I really suggest that you do buy these books. They're quite interesting. One is Long Gone by Dr. David Frew, and the other is, this I think is out of print now, but there's still some copies on Amazon you can get, The Ghost Ships of the Great Lakes by Dwight Boyer. Long Gone is the only book, at least that I'm aware of, that is specifically about the disappearance and the sinking of the Marquette Bessemer. Um, Mr. Boyer's book is more generalized, but there is a really interesting chapter on there. And in that chapter is where he covers the speculation about whether there was foul play with respect to Captain McLeod. So here is a more detailed map of Lake Erie. It is one of the 5 Great Lakes. It's the 4th largest Great Lake. Just to give you an idea of how large it is, though, the entire counties of Los Angeles, San Diego, and Orange County in Southern California, where I'm originally from, could easily fit within this lake. Surface area, almost 10,000 square miles. From Toledo to Buffalo, Toledo here on the west end, Buffalo on the east end, it's well over 200 miles. The Lake Huron up here at the top feeds into Lake Erie over here on the western side, and then Lake Erie feeds into Lake Ontario, which is off the map, through the Niagara Falls here at the east end of the lake. And then, by the way, this line, bright line, white line here in the middle, is the border between the United States and Canada. So what's really interesting about Lake Erie and what makes it so dangerous, as I mentioned earlier, is how shallow it is. And what this illustration shows you is the relative depths of the Great Lakes, and noting the deepest part of the lake. So Lake Superior goes down to 1,330 feet. Lake Michigan and Huron, 750 feet, 923 feet. And then Lake Ontario, again, which Lake Erie feeds into, is 802 feet. Lake Erie, in contrast, is very, very shallow, only 210 feet at its deepest point. By the way, it's the only one of the Great Lakes that is entirely above sea level. Even the bottom of the lake is above sea level. So it's incredibly shallow. Its average depth is only 65 feet. And in the central basin, we're going to talk about that, which is where the Marquette Bessemer was traveling. Uh, the the average depth there is only approximately 60 feet. And by the way, another very famous shipwreck that many associate with Lake Erie is, of course, the Edmund Fitzgerald that sank back in '76, made famous by the great song by Gordon, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot. Um, that sank in about 500 feet of water out in Lake Superior. And by the way, I think personally that the wreck of the Marquette Bessemer, or the disappearance really of the Marquette Bessemer #2, is far more interesting and captivating than the Edmund Fitzgerald. It sank pretty much under similar circumstances, but uh, that fact that it still hasn't been found again, I think that is the most enduring mystery. Why something so large, made of steel, in such a shallow lake has yet to be found is just fascinating to me. At any rate, and some of this I might be explaining my own questions as we go through this. So and getting right to that, here is a satellite image of Lake Erie, and what you'll notice, as I just discussed with you, is how shallow the lake is. The lake is basically cut into three segments, if you will: Western Basin over here, Basin, and the Eastern Basin. Okay, the green stuff you're seeing here is exactly what you think it is. It is algae. Uh, the Western Basin, is extremely shallow. There's parts of it that are less than 10 feet deep. The average depth is only 25 feet. So it's basically like a big Olympic swimming pool over here on this side. Because it's so shallow, it gets extremely warm in the spring and the summer, which allows the algae to thrive. The reason you don't see as much algae over here is it's deeper. Here again, this is the Central Basin, average depth not 25 feet, but 60 feet. And then over here, the average depth, I believe, is about 85 feet. This is the deepest part of the lake and has the deepest portion, or the deepest, it's really like a valley right around here. It's about, the deepest part again is about 210 feet. And that's why you don't see as much of the algae out here. Which, by the way, this is where a lot of the walleye fishing is done. Out here is where you'll have the best walleye fishing in this portion of the lake, again, because it is so deep and it's much clearer. The algae, of course, is not good for fishing. It sucks the oxygen out of the lake and makes it very difficult for the fish, sometimes causing a lot of fish to die. Okay, so approximately here is where Conneaut is. About right here is Port Stanley. Again, 55 miles across. So what this shows, this is a map put out by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a very detailed map that you can use for navigating the lake, and we're going to discuss this here in a little bit more detail. I'm going to be zooming in around these areas. Okay. So zooming in here on the Central Basin, you could ignore this red circle and lines that I put in here for the time being. You'll notice all these little black dots in here. What those are gas wells. These, there's well over 100 of them in this area. Port Stanley is right up here. Conneaut, Ohio is right down here at the bottom. Okay, 55 miles across. Now, Dr. Frew's book, Long Gone, what he states, and I agree with him on this, is that wherever she is not anywhere close to gas wells. Why? Well, because those are maintained. Companies are diving down on them, repairing them, putting in new wells quite a bit. If she had sunk anywhere in any of this area, she would have been found by now. Somebody in the gas industry on the Canadian side would have found her. And again, right here, by the way, you can see this is the Canadian border, United States and Canada. all the gas wells are on the north side or on the Canadian side. Some have speculated that she might be around Long Point, and we'll talk about that here in a minute too, but just note that Long Point also has a number of gas wells, especially around this side. Some say that, or believe that she started here on December 7th, encountered a storm, struggled over to get to Port Stanley, couldn't get into Port Stanley because of the storm, turned around turned and either went up here, up to, there was another harbor up this way, or she just turned around and tried to come back to Conneaut, which most likely, considering where their sightings were, and there's no indication that there are any sightings up this way in this northwest part of the lake. So at any rate, although others have said she might have tried to make what's called Long Point here, which is a big sandy point. This is about 20 miles in length. It obviously has a natural harbor, which, by the way, whenever there's a storm, 99% of the time when there's a storm, and certainly that time when the Marquette Bessemer No. 2 sank, the storms generally travel from the southwest toward the northeast, and this is the way it blows. The wind blows, of course, the seas travel, and of course the current. So, as we already discussed, the fatal flaw in the Marquette Bessemer No. 2's design was the lack of a stern gate. So, if she's traveling this way, if she's trying to get from Conneaut or from Port Stanley over to Long Point, she's going to be in following seas that she's going to have the waves, in other words, coming from her back end or her stern, which makes her extremely vulnerable. Captain McLeod already knew that. He had experience with it. Again, a month prior, he almost lost the ship in similar circumstances. So I think the chances and the likelihood of him running all the way out here, which is about 35, 40 miles to Port Stanley, is to Long Point, is highly unlikely. And if he did, the likelihood of him sinking earlier in his voyage than later is obviously far more likely than surviving out here and then sinking all of a sudden. And again, I think if he would have sunk around Long Point, he would have been, or she would have been found by now, because of all the gas wells in the area. Okay, so now turning to our next map here. Again, just the gas wells. You could just focusing in a little bit more here on Port Stanley. You can see just in more detail how many gas wells there are. So let's now focus down here. Now, what Dr. Frew said, just focusing on what he has hypothesized and what I've inferred from what he's written, not only would she be away from the gas wells, which means she's going to be south of Canada or on the United States side, but he also hypothesized that she's going to be in about 60 to 80 feet of water and southeast of Port Stanley. And that makes sense. Southeast of Port Stanley. Again, Port Stanley is going to be up here. This is the route to Port Stanley. So she would just follow that back. So she's going to be somewhere southeast of Port Stanley, away from the gas wells, and in 60 to 80 feet of water. This is approximately a little over 60 to 70 feet of water right here. And the reason why he believes that she would be in such relatively deep water is because of her size. If she's 60 feet from keel to the top of the bridge, well, in 60 feet of water, she's going to be right there at the surface, and it would be very easy to see or run over her. And even if she sank 10 feet into the muck, when there is evidence of other shipwrecks in the past having sunk for a variety of reasons into the muck, or at least settled somewhat, even if she had settled 10 feet, she's only going to be 10 feet below the surface. So it's going to have to be relatively deep. And here is a relatively deep part southeast away from the gas wells. This is an arbitrary circle just that I threw up there. Um, that is that is at least consistent with Dr. Frew's broad outline. But I'm going to hone in on this now as we consider some more evidence. And by the way, this line, this red line, the red arrows here, each arrow is 5 statutory miles. Yes, I should have used nautical miles, but I'm assuming statutory miles because I'm not sure about a lot of the reports that I've read and research that I've done, whether when people report sightings and or locations or things that are happening, they've never specified nautical or statutory. Statutory, of course, is 5,280 feet, a little bit less than a nautical mile. So I'm trying to be somewhat conservative here. Maybe I erred, and maybe I should have used nautical miles, but we'll see. So each of these is 5 statutory miles. I start here in between Conneaut and Ashtabula. This is approximately where I live, right on Lake Erie. Part of the reason why I'm so fascinated by this wreck, since it could literally be in my backyard. Okay, so now I spoke to a gentleman who does some underwater scuba diving and has dived on several shipwrecks in Lake Erie. And what he suspects is, at the very least, and this is going to make sense, that wherever she is, she's going to be away from shipping lanes. So, now taking my arbitrary but consistent with Dr. Frew's supposition, or at least the variables that he input on where she would be, and taking this very broad red circle here, which by the way is about 40 square miles, so I'm not really narrowing down anything too much. If you look at this, if you look at these lines here, these purple lines, those are shipping lanes. Whether they were the same shipping lanes in 1909, I have no idea. But I'm going to assume for a second that, well, actually, it really doesn't matter if they are or not. These are the shipping lanes as they've been for the last couple of decades. And the reason why he thinks they're, this gentleman told me he believes that they are away from the shipping lanes is obviously if she's not too deep in the water, and considering her size and how shallow the lake is, if she were in the shipping lanes, people would be hitting her. People, large commercial traffic. There are Lakers now on the lake that they didn't have in 1909. 1909, the Marquette Bessemer No. 2 was one of the largest, if not, I believe, the largest ship on the lake at that time. It's completely dwarfed now by the Lakers that are over 1,000 feet that now traverse Lake Erie. And those have a considerable draft. They would definitely hit something if it had sunk right in a shipping lane. So that makes sense. She's not going to be in or nearby a shipping lane. So I've circumscribed that, or just a better term is, I've reduced the circle here, the green circle, to a little bit more narrower field to rule out that she's going to be around these shipping lanes. So maybe she's in here. And a lot of people don't go this far out in the lake unless it's commercial traffic. Perch fishing, from personal experience, you're going to be within 3 to 5 miles of the shoreline, which is right around here. You can see this is about 5 miles due north, right out. So that's about the extent you're going to do for perch fishing. For walleye, you can go a lot farther out, but generally people are fishing over here in this part of the lake for walleye. Certainly in Ashtabula, a lot of fishing is done out of Ashtabula, not as much as Erie, but there is, and they can go out over here too. I don't see a lot of people, I can't see a lot of people fishing out here because it's past the horizon. So at any rate, very few people, if they are fishing, they're going to be fishing for walleye, and they're going to be in small commercial boats, and they're probably not going to have significant draft where they're going to hit the boat. This blue line here, what this indicates is there have been other reports, going back to Dr. or Mr. Boyer's, his book. What he discusses here is there was, back in 1932, there was a tug called the Jack, and the Jack reported hitting something 35 miles southwest of Long Point when it was traveling from Buffalo, which would be up this part of the map, toward Detroit, which is going to be over here on the western side of Lake Erie. So, assuming that this was the approximate route that he would be taking to go toward Detroit from Buffalo, I calculated 35 miles out from Long Point. So let's just see Long Point again really quick here. So here is Long Point, okay? 35 miles southwest of Long Point is going to be right in this area, okay? So that's what I did here. That's what this line indicates, 35 miles away in statutory miles to the tip of Long Point. And this blue line here, basically, it should be a slight curve, but my arts and crafts aren't that good. So I just use a straight line here. But this approximates 35 miles from Long Point. So somewhere along here is where she could be found. Or somebody hit something along this line. Or I should say somebody. The Jack hit something along somewhere in this area here, and it's going to be away from shipping lanes. Again, assuming though the Jack was close to a shipping lane, or was in a shipping lane, and maybe the Marquette Bessemer has since moved, then the most likely place that's consistent with everything we've discussed, with what Dr. Frew has said, Mr. Boyer, the salvage operator I consulted with, all of that, the most consistent place then that she would be is somewhere in this vicinity, okay? But there's one other piece that I've recently discovered by doing some research online, and I'm trying to verify it with the source right now. A gentleman wrote a very interesting article about the Marquette and Bessemer, and he claims that that people have seen the Marquette and Bessemer from the air approximately 8 miles, okay, northeast of Conneaut. They've seen it from the air, through the water. Now, immediately one might say, how is that possible? Well, especially, how is that possible if the lake is so murky, filled with algae, etc., etc., etc.? And that is true. But there are times of the year where you can see, where the lake is very clear. And here is one recent example. This was from out in Lake Michigan. This was a news article recently where the Coast Guard was able to spot wrecks from the air. Now, they were in shallow waters. This is about in 6 to 12 feet of water, and you could see it quite clearly, this wreck here. But note, after the lake's ice melts and before summer sediment swirls and algae blooms. Well, that will be coming up. That's generally around March and April. And that's exactly when this was spotted. It was spotted in April of last year. Marquette Bessemer is nowhere near in 6 to 12 feet of water, but it could be a mere 6 to 12 feet under the surface, at least part of it there. The Marquette and Bessemer, 350 feet long, 60 feet top to bottom, 50 feet a beam, 50 feet across. So even if it's turned on its side, it's still, and if it's in 60 feet of water, it's only going to be 6 feet, or maybe a little less if it's settled into the lake bottom, but anywhere from 6 to 10 feet below the surface. And this is in 6 to 12 feet of water. Lake Erie gets as clear as Lake Michigan at those same times of the year. A lot of that, by the way, has to do with an invasive species that has plagued all the Great Lakes, very much so here at Lake Erie, and these are the zebra mussels that were introduced in the 80s as a result of foreign shipping traffic coming in and emptying bilge water. Zebra mussels are not indigenous to the Great Lakes. But one of the things that the zebra mussels do, whether it's good or not, but one of the things that they do is they clarify the water. So the zebra mussels could help in discovering or seeing the Marquette Bessemer number 2. So considering that, now taking this other piece of uncorroborated evidence, for whatever that is worth, what I did here in this little purple circle is indicate just an approximation. This is approximately 8 miles, northeast of Conneaut, Ohio. 35 miles, and I've just taken this 35 miles again because the jack hit something back in 1932. And this is approximately on the route it may have been taking. And also considering that this is where somebody said they saw something in the water. This could be where it's at. Now, I don't include it here because it's in a little shallow, it's in shallow water, relatively shallow water, certainly shallower than Dr. Frew speculates where it would be found. But again, the salvage operator I spoke to, this still would be consistent with what he said. It's away from a shipping lane. It's certainly out farther. This is about 5 miles. If we just took the right angle from the shoreline of Pennsylvania, it's about 5 and I believe about 5.5 miles straight out. That is probably at the very edge of where you would be perch fishing, and it is too close to the shore where one would be walleye fishing. Walleye fishing is done further out in the lake. So this would be a spot that not many people travel, and it's a little bit off the shipping lane too. So it's, if you will, a dead travel zone part of the lake, but it's not that deep. But if somebody says they've seen something, and we've seen that's possible, this might be actually where it is. Now, I used to think it was here, but taking this further evidence, again, uncooperated, perhaps it is out here. It wouldn't make much of a, it wouldn't take too much or extra effort to try to verify this small location with some sonar, or Sitescan sonar. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Here is a hydrograph of the bottom of Lake Erie, also produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And this, if we just go back here real quick, you could see what I'm going to show you Long Point and something called the Clear Creek Ridge. This is the Clear Creek Ridge. It is completely underwater, okay? But I just want you to focus on that as we go to the next slide here. Again, here's Long Point, and this is the Clear Creek Ridge, again, completely submerged, that I was just indicating to you. The Clear Creek Ridge separates the eastern basin from the central basin, and you can see the natural hydrography, or topology is probably a better term, that separates the central basin from the western basin here. What's most notable about the central basin, frankly, is it's just a big bowl. There's not a lot of interesting stuff going on here. It's flat. And we're talking, this here is about 65, maybe 75 feet here. The rest is around 60 to 70 feet, and this might be a little bit deeper here. But at any rate, this is if you will, the natural cutoff. This point right here, okay, is just to the southwest of Clear Creek Ridge. And if we look here just the southwest of Clear Creek Ridge, we could see, again, very flat. Point simply is, it's going to be easy to spot. Certainly this did not sink completely into the lake bed. There was the CB Lockwood that was recently discovered just outside of Cleveland. It had sunk into the muck It foundered back in 1911, I believe, and was completely lost. Recently rediscovered when an earthquake, believe it or not, there are earthquakes out here in Ohio. An earthquake right off of Cleveland cleared the sediment that had been burying it, or that had buried it. I spoke to the gentleman who had rediscovered the CB Lockwood, asked him if the same thing could have happened to the Marquette Bessemer number 2, and he said he didn't think so. Primarily, the reason being is you have to have the right conditions, and they're very rare. The right conditions to have a wreck completely sink into the muck like the CB Lockwood. Those don't exist out here in this part of the lake. Cleveland, by the way, is right around here, and this is the area that we've been discussing of the lake. So, and those points, those don't really exist. By the way, this ridge, it's not some coral or rock ridge. This is just sand, just like here, the Long Point. This is all just sand. The next slide, we're going to be taking a look, a three-dimensional look up this way of the lake. We're going to be looking from the southwest towards the northeast, and to give you a better indication. So again, here's Long Point. Right about down here is Conneaut. Over here is Port Stanley. This is the Clear Creek Ridge. And you can see it's, there's some sophistication here, maybe some valleys somewhat, but they're not going to be very deep valleys that it could have fallen into somewhere around those lines. But this is nowhere near where I think it is. I think it's going to be, again, this is the Clear Creek Ridge, southeast of the Clear Creek Ridge. It's going to be in this very flat, dull part of the lake. Easy to find. Finally, this is a computer rendering by National Geographic. They had a very interesting documentary called Drain the Great Lakes. That if you're interested in the Great Lakes generally, it's a very interesting documentary. You could find it on YouTube. But this is just a still of Clear Creek Ridge. They've drained Lake Erie, at least in part, so you can see Clear Creek Ridge. This is Long Point going out this direction over here. So yeah, I think it's going to be right over here. And even you can see Clear Creek Ridge when it's drained. And they, by the way, National Geographic used this data here to render this impression of the Clear Creek Ridge. You can see it isn't all that sophisticated. So even if it's the Marquette Bessemer number 2 had foundered somewhere along here, actually should be a little bit even easier to find. The point simply is it's not hidden in some cave. There's not some ledge that is readily identifiable in the data that has been provided, that's publicly available, to that a 350-foot, 2,500-ton steel ship could be easily hidden under for 100 years. Why hasn't it been found after 100 years? Well, that's the million-dollar question, as it were. Not only is there an interesting ghost story behind this, but there's a treasure issue. There was exactly one passenger on the Marquette and Bessemer the day it sailed on its last day towards Port Stanley, and that was a gentleman by the name of I don't think he's up here, and unfortunately I forgot his name, but I don't think he's one of these gentlemen here. He was he wasn't found. He worked for a fishing company in Erie. He had $32,000 of cash on him, and he was tasked by his employers to go over to Port Stanley to purchase another company, another fishery out in Port Stanley. Of course, he never made it, neither did his money. Those in the know believe that this $32,000 was locked in a safe. That safe should still be there, of course, unless somebody else has salvaged it, which again is highly doubtful. Also, supposedly, there was another $50,000 in the ship's safe. So there's some money sitting down there. And you would think treasure hunters, notwithstanding the very sophisticated maritime salvage laws on the Great Lakes, which, as I understand them, they're very different on the Great Lakes than they are out in international waters in the ocean. But notwithstanding those, you would think that there would be some folks still would want to find it, look for it, and claim, have their claim to fame. Uh, Now, there are those who have claimed to have found the Marquette and Bessemer, but have not, or just refused to disclose where it is. I take I take no credence in any of those claims. I can just as easily claim I know where it is, but I'm not going to tell you. That's meaningless. So if I find it, by the way, I'm going to tell the world immediately. And if you haven't figured it out by now, this is what I plan to do with my summer vacation. Um, One of the things that I think that one of the reasons too, an additional reason why I don't think it has been found, is there has not been the use or the proper use of side scanning sonars. This is an image of a side scan sonar that was used recently to find the Argo. It was a barge, as you can see here, that sank back in 1937. It's out here on Lake Erie. It's leaking, by the way. This was from just this last October. The point simply is nothing about the Argo, but to show you the detail that can be had with a side scan sonar. And I'm not sure how deep this is, but as we already know, the Marquette and Bessemer #2, wherever it is on this lake, or at least in this area, it's not very far down. It's going to be in 60 to 80 feet of water at most. And now, from what I've said, most likely less. Here, that's going to be barely 60 feet of water. We're looking at about 18 meters. So that's that's almost 60 feet. So it's going to be very shallow. In other words, you'll be able to see it quite clearly, just probably more clearly than this. Side scanning sonar is not very expensive. This isn't like Robert Ballard and the having to go get a huge NOAA ship and spend millions of dollars, $500 on Amazon or Jet, and you can get a side scanning sonar, run out there, and spend a few hours going back and forth to see if you can see it. Or, another crazy idea, since people have claimed to see it from the air, is now you can get one of those little remote control drones for a few $100s, with the camera on it. Throw it up on your boat, and hopefully you can control it well, and it's not stormy out. You take it up, about 100 feet, and see what you can see. And all of this can be done in an afternoon. And if I'm right, it shouldn't take very long. The longest part of finding the Marquette and Bessemer really should be the trip out of Conneaut. And you're not going to need salvage or scuba gear to dive down on it. Even at 60 feet, I grew up in Southern California, and I was able to skin dive down that and a little bit more. Now it's hard to do, but it can be done, especially if the water is cooperative, if it's not too stormy out. But at any rate, if she's only 10 feet down, you just jump in and you'll probably touch her with your feet pretty quick. So that essentially sums up my thoughts on the Marquette and Bessemer. I think it's a fascinating story. I feel like Richard Dreyfuss's character in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it's become kind of an obsession for me. And part of that obsession is not only the interesting history behind the Marquette and Bessemer and the tragedy that struck, but really the fact that nobody has found her to this day, when she just putting all the evidence together that's been reported. She's most likely, I believe, right about there or here. Really, somewhere in this region. Now, yes, that somewhere is big, but at the right time of year, uh, and the conditions are right, it shouldn't be hard to spot her, either from the air or even with satellite imagery. NOAA puts out some very detailed satellite images, even more detailed than this, on an hourly basis. So just follow. She could be found just doing some armchair sleuthing, as I call it, as of what I've been doing. So at any rate, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Look forward to any comments, criticisms, suggestions. Stay tuned. Maybe I'll have a follow-up in a few months and get to tell everybody, see, I found it. There she is. Thank you.